It was supposed to be just another quiet summer hearing, tucked between recess sessions, half-empty chairs, and lukewarm coffee. But 46 seconds in, the entire room went silent. No one shouted. No gavel was slammed. It was a question. One single question. And the moment it landed, every eye turned to one man, Mitch McConnell. Known in Washington circles as the silent architect of budget power, McConnell had built a legacy on precision, discretion, and control. But today, in this chamber, he didn't speak. He didn't blink. And that silence was louder than anything he'd ever said. Sitting across from him was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't angry. She didn't even raise her voice. She just sat there, her right hand resting on a thick folder, her eyes locked on his, steady as steel. The folder had no title, but inside it held 17 years' worth of a story no one wanted told. And floating in the air, above the silence, above the tension, was a number, $4.2 billion. And a question no one had ever dared to ask out loud. Where did it all go? That's when you could feel it. The temperature in the room dropped. Phones were slowly lowered. Staffers stopped typing. One by one, even seasoned members of Congress leaned forward. Not because they wanted drama, but because something felt off. This wasn't about partisan bickering. This wasn't about red versus blue. This was about math, about records, about 17 years of money meant for the people vanished without a trace. And Jasmine Crockett, she wasn't here to make headlines. She came for answers. So when she finally spoke, she didn't start with a speech. She just opened the folder and said one sentence. Mr. McConnell, you've chaired 6 of the last 8 budget negotiations. This allocation passed under your leadership. 17 years, $4.2 billion, and still no drainage systems, no reports, no oversight. Can you explain that? McConnell didn't flinch. He didn't answer. But in that stillness, the hearing room changed. It wasn't just a committee session anymore. It became a reckoning. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the man who had shaped trillions in federal spending found himself unwilling to explain the fate of just one line item. One that was never meant to disappear. One that starting today would no longer be ignored. Because Crockett wasn't just asking for her district. She was speaking for every flooded street, every forgotten promise, every voice that had been told to wait while the money went somewhere else. And this was just the beginning. Because to understand what happened in that room, we need to go back to 2008. When floodwaters swallowed small towns and sirens echoed through communities that had no levees, Congress rushed to act. They called it the Federal Resilience Allocation, a quiet name for what was meant to be a lifeline. A $4.2 billion program stretched across 17 years, designed to shield the most vulnerable communities from the devastating effects of climate change. Coastal towns in Mississippi, river cities in Illinois, rural Kentucky hollers too often overlooked. They were all promised the same thing. Funding for infrastructure that could save lives. Drainage systems, flood walls, emergency access roads, community resilience plans. On paper, it looked like hope. On the ground, nothing changed. Fast forward to this summer. A quiet report dropped from the Federal Audit Office. Not a headline, not a press release, but buried in the 3rd paragraph, one figure hit like a thunderclap. As of Q1 this year, 62.4% of the allocated funds under the FRA program cannot be accounted for through direct project disbursement to target communities. 62% gone, dispersed, or worse, never delivered. And then came the second blow. 91% of expenditure records related to FRA program disbursement remain sealed at the request of Senate leadership. No names listed, no justifications provided. But Crockett had already done her homework. She knew who chaired the Appropriations Subcommittee in 2009, 2012, 2016, 2021. And every time, the trail led to one signature, Mitch McConnell. But then came the audit report that changed everything. Buried in the 3rd paragraph was a figure that hit like a thunderclap. What made it worse wasn't just the missing money. It was the silence. For over a decade, families rebuilt their flooded homes with borrowed cash. Local officials begged FEMA for extra assistance. School buses rerouted around collapsed roads for years on end. And no one ever mentioned the federal resilience allocation. Because for many in power, that program wasn't broken. It was forgotten intentionally. The sealed documents weren't just numbers. They were shields. Shields to protect what? Political allies, contractors, a pattern of redirection no one wanted exposed. What Crockett saw in those sealed folders wasn't just negligence. It was design. A system built to look like it was helping while doing exactly the opposite. And for every mother who carried her child through waist-deep water, for every family still waiting on a promised evacuation route, for every town whose sirens have long rusted from disuse, Jasmine Crockett brought one thing to this hearing: the receipts. She didn't come to speculate. She came to name it. This wasn't an error. It was a decision. And if Washington didn't want to ask where the money went, then she would, out loud and on the record. For years, it flew under the radar. No press briefings, no debates, not even a mention in the annual oversight reports. The federal resilience allocation became a ghost program, technically alive, legally authorized, but practically invisible. Most Americans had never even heard of it. And maybe that was the point, because buried deep in congressional appendices, hidden between line items for agriculture relief and homeland security, were allocations labeled supplemental coastal readiness or regional resilience offsets. Technical language confusing on purpose, designed to deflect, not inform. But Jasmine Crockett read between the lines. She found the pattern. Money didn't disappear. It was rerouted, sent through private contractors with vague names, many with little to no track record. A few stood out. One firm, Blue Ridge Solutions, received $76 million over 3 years despite having just 4 full-time employees and no public-facing infrastructure projects. Another, Glenmont Strategies, was paid $112 million for community liaison services. Yet not a single local mayor or emergency coordinator had ever heard of them. And when the House Oversight Committee requested access to full disbursement records in 2016, 2019, and again in 2022, each internal audit was abruptly canceled, citing national security considerations. National security for flood infrastructure. Even journalists who tried to dig deeper hit brick walls. FOIA requests were stalled. Sources went silent. One investigative reporter who got close said she received a call warning her to leave it alone. It's above your pay grade. And then came the silence from the Senate floor. Not one Republican senator had mentioned the FRA by name in over a decade. Not once. It was as if the program didn't exist in record, in speeches, in debates. But the money moved. The contracts were signed. And behind every paper trail was a human cost. But today that silence was breaking. Because Jasmine Crockett had received something that changed everything. Came in an unmarked envelope. No return address. No message. Just a thumb drive tucked inside a folded sheet of paper with 7 words scrawled in black ink. They won't bury this if you don't. At first, Jasmine Crockett didn't know what to make of it. But once the files loaded, she understood exactly what she was looking at. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't rumor. It was confirmation. There it was. An internal spreadsheet showing the full breakdown of the federal resilience allocation across 17 years. Every year, every dollar, every recipient, the names of companies, the routing banks, the payout dates. And tucked at the bottom, an attachment labeled FRA Strategic Priority Directive, classified top secret, no release. Except one line had been missed. The file's metadata. And that single line changed everything. Author, M. McConnell. Date created, the 17th of June, 2008, 6:42 a.m. Last modified by M. McConnell. In one click, Crockett had what years of audits and investigations failed to uncover. Proof that the man now sitting across from her had signed off on a directive that never went through congressional debate, never saw the light of day, and yet had steered billions under the guise of resilience. She sat back in her chair, heart pounding but steady. This wasn't just a policy failure. This was a deliberate maneuver to bypass transparency. A 17-year detour with one silent conductor. Crockett didn't go to the press. She didn't leak it online. She did one thing. She submitted a formal request to speak at the upcoming oversight hearing on equitable allocation of disaster recovery funds. Her request was approved. When she arrived at the Capitol that morning, she wasn't holding a policy memo. She was holding proof, and everyone was about to see it. The room was full, but the energy was cold. No applause, no tension yet, just a dull anticipation hanging in the air as the gavel struck wood. And then Mitch McConnell began to speak. His voice low and steady, barely rose above a whisper, but every word was calculated. No stutters, no missteps. He didn't glance at notes. He didn't need to. "We are a nation built on trust," he said, "and on expertise. We entrust local governments to carry out what they know best because Washington cannot pretend to understand every floodplain, every storm drain, every mile of coastline." He paused just long enough for the room to nod. The role of the federal government is not to micromanage but to empower. The tools were provided, the resources were made available. If there were failures, those failures lie with those who didn't act locally, not with those who provided nationally. It was classic McConnell, measured, untouchable. He didn't deny the money existed. He didn't even deny the program. But with each word, he redirected the spotlight away from himself and onto the governors, the mayors, the agencies. "I understand there are questions. There always are," he added. "But let's be clear. No senator here handpicks how a town installs a drainage system. That's not how this country works." The room murmured in quiet agreement. A few heads nodded. Even the cameras shifted slightly, zooming in on sympathetic faces. It looked like he had regained control. But what no one realized, what even McConnell seemed to underestimate, was that Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to argue policy. She had come to hold the receipts. Jasmine Crockett stepped to the microphone without a single page out of place. No theatrics, no grandstanding, just the folder now open. Her fingers moved deliberately. She flipped to the first tab and read aloud. Line item 12, fiscal year 2012. $187 million directed to Kentucky Blue Corp for infrastructure upgrades and flood mitigation. She paused. Kentucky Blue Corp filed for bankruptcy in 2009. The room froze. Line item 47, fiscal year 2016. $390 million labeled as community services deployment, rural regions. She looked up. No documented recipient, no public records, no rollout plan. Not a single photo, not a single report, nothing. Her voice remained steady, but each sentence cut deeper. 17 years, $4.2 billion. 71% of those funds cannot be publicly accounted for. And the people of Kentucky, your people, Senator, are still living on flood-prone land with no drainage systems. There was no sound except the low hum of cameras and the distant scratch of pens trying to keep up. Crockett turned the page. 3 internal audits, all canceled. 1 citing national security, 1 citing redundant oversight, and 1 simply marked, "Do not proceed." She let the words hang. Then she turned to McConnell directly. "Who signed off on those cancellations?" No response. "Who authorized the reclassification of funding reports under federal contractor clauses?" No response. She nodded slightly, then held up a single printed page, its edges frayed from use. This document was submitted to the FRA task force in 2008. Its authorship is redacted, but the metadata embedded within it reads clear as day. M. McConnell. Gasps audible now. She lowered the page. "I'm not here to accuse. I'm here to ask because out there are 9 million Americans living in regions that this program was meant to protect. They've waited 17 years. Her voice grew softer. 17 hurricane seasons. 17 years of rebuilding the same homes, of wading through the same muddy water every year, of praying the next flood won't take a school, a clinic, a grandmother, a child. Crockett didn't cry, but there was emotion now. Not anger, not vengeance. Something deeper, tired, determined. We sit here in suits under lights on dry floors, but they're out there asking where the help went. And what do we give them? A sealed file, a missing signature. She closed the folder gently. The sound of the clasp echoed in the silence. They deserve more than a shrug. Then she looked back to McConnell. I'm not asking you to explain away every dollar. I'm asking you to tell them just once where it went. But McConnell didn't move, didn't blink. And that silence, the one he had once used as power, now sounded like guilt. McConnell didn't move, didn't blink. And that silence now sounded like guilt. Took less than 2 hours. By lunchtime, the clip had already gone viral, shared, reshared, and rebroadcast across the nation. On MSNBC, the cheerin' read, "For .2 billion missing, McConnell silent during heated hearing." CNN looped it under the headline, "Where did it go?" Crockett confronts budget secrecy head-on. Even Fox News couldn't ignore it. They didn't frame it as a scandal yet, but they aired it unedited. McConnell sitting, staring, not speaking. That silence traveled. By evening, 2 hashtags lit up every trending chart. Number 4, hashtag 4.2 billion question. Number 1, hashtag where did it go? And while pundits argued about motives and allies scrambled to reframe the moment, one person didn't wait. A freelance journalist from Louisville posted screenshots of 3 contracts. Each matched the exact vendor names Crockett had read aloud. Each one had been quietly scrubbed from the Congressional Contract Archives sometime in 2021. But this reporter had backups, saved PDFs, metadata timestamps, internal memos, proof. Within 24 hours, the Internal Oversight Committee sent an official letter to the Senate Appropriations Office demanding a reopening of all disbursement reviews related to Kentucky infrastructure funds under the federal resilience allocation. For the first time in 17 years, the sealed files were being called back into the light. Still, McConnell didn't respond. No press conference, no rebuttal, no denial, just a short 14-word statement released by his office at 6:13 p.m. "We are currently in the process of reviewing documentation received from impacted state agencies." No acknowledgement, no apology, and still no answers. But the damage had already spread. A firestorm of FOIA requests flooded agencies in Kentucky, Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. Citizen watchdogs organized digital town halls. And quietly, behind the scenes, a bipartisan group of lawmakers began drafting a proposal for a new transparency mandate that would make it impossible to seal any future disaster funding records without full congressional review. What Jasmine Crockett had sparked wasn't just a political moment. It was a shift. No one expected a single question to shake the foundation of 17 years of silence. But that's exactly what happened. Jasmine Crockett didn't ask to go viral. She didn't ask to be a headline. She asked because someone had to. In a system where silence is often mistaken for wisdom, where closed doors are labeled protocol, and where billions can disappear behind a polished smile, she made one radical choice. To speak, not with fury, not with spectacle, but with facts, with patience, and with the weight of every family still living on floodplain roads, waiting for help that never came. Because not every injustice hides in the dark. Some wear expensive suits. Some sit at powerful desks. Some call themselves stability. But the truth doesn't need noise to survive. It just needs someone brave enough to say it out loud. 17 years of sealed records didn't fall because of a scandal. They cracked because one woman refused to let the silence win. So the next time someone tells you a question is too small, too late, or too inconvenient, remember this. The most powerful thing in a broken room is the person who doesn't look away. And this time, that person was Jasmine Crockett.